They said her husband died suddenly. But in the village, no death is ever just a death. Before the sun had fully risen that morning, whispers were already moving faster than footsteps. Doors stayed half closed, eyes watched from behind mud walls, and when her name was spoken, it was never spoken aloud. She was a widow now, just like that. No warning. No last words. No time to ask why. In this village, when a man dies without explanation, people do not ask questions. They look at his wife. They said she must prove her innocence. Not with words. Not with tears. But with her body, her dignity, her silence. She agreed. She let them shave her hair, the same hair her husband once praised, the same hair she had carried since girlhood, until her head was bare and burning under the open sky. Then she stood before the village gods, swore oaths her mouth trembled to speak, and waited for judgment. And when she survived? When nothing happened? When the gods remained silent? The elders praised her obedience. The family smiled. The village relaxed. They said she was clean. But that was only the first test. Because in this village, proving your innocence does not mean you are forgiven. It only means you are ready to lose everything else. This is the story of a woman who obeyed every rule and was punished anyway. A story about silence, tradition, and the moment suffering becomes unbearable. Stay with me. Because what she did next was something the village was never prepared for. Before we continue, like, and subscribe. No one heard him cry out. No struggle. No warning. When the widow woke that morning, the mat beside her was already cold. Not the gentle cool of dawn, but the stiff, wrong kind that makes the body hesitate before touching again. She called his name once, softly, thinking he had stepped outside early. Then again, louder. The silence answered both times. By the time neighbors arrived, the sun was still low. Chickens wandered freely. Smoke had not yet risen from cooking fires. Yet people gathered as if summoned by something unseen. They did not rush. They did not panic. They looked, and they waited. Someone covered his body. Someone else sent a child to call the elders. No one asked how he died. The widow sat on the floor, hands pressed into her lap, trying to remember the sound of his breathing the night before. He had eaten. He had spoken. He had laughed quietly at something their daughter said. There had been no sickness. No warning. Nothing a woman could point to and say, "This is why." When the elders arrived, they did not touch her. They did not comfort her. They studied her face instead, as if grief itself might confess. In the village, sudden death carries weight. It bends conversations. It shifts eyes. By midday, people were already whispering, not accusations, just questions shaped like concern. Who last saw him? Who slept beside him? What had he eaten? What had she cooked? The widow felt it then. The change. Her husband's death was no longer the center of the gathering. She was. And as the body was carried away for preparation, one elder spoke quietly, almost gently. She must be strong. The gods will require clarity. The widow did not yet understand what that meant. But the village did. And they were already watching her more closely than they had ever watched him. No one ever said she killed him. That was the cruelest part. Instead, they spoke in circles. In careful phrases. In sentences that sounded like tradition but felt like judgment. Women stopped sitting near her. Men avoided meeting her eyes. Even children were called away when they wandered too close. She must follow custom, someone said. For peace, another added. So the village can breathe again. The widow listened from the doorway of her house, holding her daughter close as voices rose and fell outside. No one shouted. No one pointed. Yet every word pressed against her chest like a weight. That evening, the elders summoned her. She walked alone to the meeting place. Her feet remembered the path, but her body felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else now. Someone lighter. Someone already half removed from the village. The eldest man spoke slowly. When death comes without warning, truth must be invited. Another elder nodded. The gods do not hide from the innocent. She understood then. They wanted her to swear. Not a simple oath. Not words spoken in grief. They wanted the old way, the way that stripped the person down to what could not be hidden. The way that demanded sacrifice before speech. Her hair. The widow's breath caught. In the village, a woman's hair was more than beauty. It was memory. Identity. Proof of womanhood. To cut it was to declare oneself empty, ready to be filled by judgment. She thought of refusing. But refusal meant something worse than shame. It meant guilt without trial. So she bowed her head. And said she would do it. As she turned to leave, one elder added quietly, "If you are innocent, you will survive." The widow did not ask what happened if she did not. That night, she did not sleep. She sat awake, fingers buried in her hair, knowing it would be gone by morning. The sun was already high when they brought her to the clearing. People gathered, not in a crowd, but in a wide, respectful circle. Distance was important. Distance kept fear from becoming personal. The widow stood at the center, her daughter taken gently from her arms and led away by a neighbor who would not meet her eyes. The blade was small. Ordinary. That made it worse. An older woman stepped forward, the one chosen for such things. Her hands were steady. Her face showed no emotion. She did not apologize. The first cut was slow, deliberate. Hair fell to the ground like shed skin. With every stroke, the widow felt something leave her, not pain, not exactly, but history. The weight of years. The quiet pride of being seen as whole. The whispers grew louder as the pile at her feet grew thicker. When her head was bare, the air felt sharp. Exposed. They led her to the shrine. She knelt. The earth was warm beneath her knees. The elder spoke the words of the oath, each sentence heavy with expectation. She repeated them, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. She swore she had no hand in her husband's death. Swore before gods older than memory. Then, silence. No wind. No cry. No sign. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Finally, the elders nodded. She has survived, one announced. The gods have spoken. Relief moved through the circle like breath released. The widow felt weak. Empty. Alive. Women rushed to cover her head. Men spoke kindly again. Someone praised her strength. Someone else said she was brave. But as she rose to her feet, she felt it. Survival was not forgiveness. It was permission. For what came next? After the burial, the village changed its tone. People greeted her again. Some even smiled. The elder spoke of her obedience as if it were a virtue greater than innocence. She respected the gods, they said. She respected tradition. Food was brought to her house. Advice followed. Too much advice. One evening, her husband's family gathered. They did not come with anger. They came with plans. The eldest brother spoke first, carefully. "You are still young," he said. "A woman should not remain alone." Another added, "Your daughter needs protection." Then they mentioned the younger brother. The poor one. The drunkard. He sat apart from the others, eyes unfocused, smelling of palm wine even at dusk. He had never held land. Never kept a family. Yet they spoke of him as a solution, a kindness. If you marry him, they said, you stay within the family. The land remains protected. The widow listened in silence. She imagined it, sharing her life with a man she did not respect, tying her child's future to someone who could barely manage his own. This was not protection. It was control wrapped in tradition. She shook her head. "I cannot," she said quietly. The air shifted. They did not argue. They did not shout. They simply stood up and left. That night, the food stopped coming. The greetings ended. And by morning, men arrived to measure land that no longer belonged to her. The village watched and said nothing. They took the land first. Quietly. Efficiently. As if reclaiming something misplaced. Then the house, marking walls she had lived in for years as if her memories were irrelevant. The widow stood with her daughter at the edge of the compound, watching strangers touch what had once been hers. No one protested. Some looked away. Some pretended not to see. The widow learned then that silence could wound deeper than words. Hunger came quickly. Her daughter's clothes grew thin. School visits stopped. Laughter disappeared from the small space they were allowed to occupy at the edge of the village. Still, she endured. She told herself this was the price of dignity, of refusal, of survival. Until the night her daughter cried from hunger. Not loudly. Just once. A sound so small it should not have mattered. But something broke. The widow held her child and felt a shift inside her, slow, deliberate. Suffering had been bearable when it was hers alone. But this was different. The village had watched her obey. Watched her lose everything. Watched her child suffer. And now, the widow lifted her head. For the first time since her husband died, she stopped shrinking. She stopped waiting. She began to think, not of endurance, but of resistance. Quiet. Careful. Unforgiving. Because if tradition could be used to destroy her, then she would use the same silence to fight back. And the village had no idea what it had just awakened. The first person to speak to her again was not an elder. It was a woman. She came at dusk, when shadows softened faces and courage was easier to borrow. She did not enter the widow's space fully. She stood at the edge, holding a small bowl of grain as if it might accuse her. "I am sorry," the woman said, finally. Not loudly. Not convincingly. The widow thanked her anyway. That night, others followed, not in groups, never openly. A child left cassava near the doorway. Someone else dropped firewood and vanished. These small kindnesses arrived like apologies that could not be spoken aloud. The widow understood the message. They pitied her. But they would not stand beside her. In the village, kindness without courage was common. It allowed people to feel clean while remaining silent. It allowed tradition to survive without resistance. The widow did not reject the help. Hunger had stripped pride away. But she noticed something else, something sharper. Every gift came with a warning disguised as concern. "You should have agreed," one woman whispered. "It would have been easier." Easier. That word followed her into sleep. Easier meant surrender. Easier meant her daughter growing up watching obedience mistaken for virtue. The widow began to observe, carefully. She noticed which elders avoided her eyes now. Which family members benefited most from her loss. Which rules were enforced loudly, and which were ignored when power was involved. Silence had taught her how the village worked. And in that understanding, a thought formed, quiet but dangerous. If they believed she was broken, if they believed she had accepted her place, then they would never see her coming. The widow stopped asking for help. Stopped explaining herself. Stopped reacting. She began to plan. And in a village built on watching, nothing is more unsettling than a woman who stops being watched and starts watching back. The brother-in-law found her unexpectedly. Not at night. Not drunk. That alone unsettled her. He stood near the edge of the old path, swaying slightly but sober enough to focus. His eyes avoided hers at first, then lingered. "I didn't want this," he muttered. The widow said nothing. He laughed, a bitter sound. "They think I wanted you, your land, your life." He kicked the dirt. "They never ask what I want." That was the first crack. He spoke slowly after that, words loosening with each breath. About meetings she was never invited to. About how the elders argued, not about justice, but about appearances. About how her refusal had embarrassed them more than her husband's death ever could. They needed you small, he said. Because a woman who stands alone makes men uncomfortable. The widow listened, carefully. She asked no questions. Let him fill the silence with what he carried. Before he left, he said something that stayed with her. They fear you more now than when they shaved your head. Fear. That night, the widow lay awake beside her daughter, replaying his words. The village had mistaken her endurance for weakness. But endurance, she realized, was training. She now knew where power lived. Where decisions were made. And how fragile respect truly was. She did not confront anyone. She waited. Because the most dangerous resistance does not announce itself. It grows quietly, until the village realizes too late that it has changed sides. The rule was simple. Widows were not to speak in council gatherings. Not until a year had passed. Not unless invited. The widow knew this. That was why she chose market day. The village was full. Voices layered over one another. Outsiders listened without understanding the weight of certain words. Elders sat comfortably, confident in the familiar order of things. The widow walked into the open space, bareheaded. Her daughter beside her. The silence was immediate. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She told a story. A simple one about her husband. About his kindness. About his sudden death. About how she followed every rule, cut her hair, swore oaths, endured hunger. She spoke calmly, deliberately. Pausing often. Letting the crowd fill the gaps with their own discomfort. Then she asked a single question. If obedience is parody, why does it leave children hungry? No one answered. The elders shifted. Some stood. One raised his voice to remind her of custom. She bowed her head, respectfully. I know, she said. That is why I waited. The damage was done. People murmured. Outsiders stared. Questions formed where silence once lived. The widow took her daughter's hand and walked away. That night, the village buzzed, not with outrage, but uncertainty. Tradition had not been broken loudly. It had been exposed. And once a rule is questioned in public, it never fully recovers. They tried to correct it. Elders summoned her again, this time with irritation thinly veiled as authority. They warned her about disrespect. About shame. About consequences. She listened, quietly. Then she asked for something unexpected. A recount. Of her husband's land. Of the harvest taken. Of the protection promised but never given. The request unsettled them. Records were not meant for widows. Questions were not meant to be returned. Some elders refused to meet her eyes. Others spoke too quickly. Contradictions slipped through cracks created by pressure. People began to notice. Not rebellion. But discomfort. The widow did not demand restitution. She demanded clarity. And clarity, in a system built on silence, was dangerous. Support did not arrive loudly. It came in pauses. In hesitations. In elders who no longer spoke as one voice. In villagers who stopped looking away. The drunkard brother-in-law avoided her now. Fear had replaced resentment. The widow felt it. The village was shifting. Not toward justice. But toward exposure. And sometimes, that was enough. Still, she knew better than to celebrate. Villages do not forgive easily. They wait. Help finally arrived, officially. An elder announced that arrangements could be reconsidered. That perhaps she could remain on a small portion of land. That the matter had become complicated. The widow listened. Then she did something no one expected. She refused. gasp followed. I did not speak, she said calmly. To be managed. She stood straight, bare head lifted, voice steady. I spoke so my daughter would not learn silence as survival. The elder stared at her. The crowd waited. The widow gathered her few belongings that night. Took her child by the hand. Walked away from the land she had once begged to keep. She left the village, not defeated, but unowned. Behind her, tradition remained, but altered. Questioned. Uneasy. And in the days that followed, whenever injustice rose quietly, someone remembered the widow who obeyed everything, and still said no. The village would never admit it. But it had been changed. And change, once witnessed, does not disappear. She did not intend to return to the village. Leaving had taken more strength than staying ever did. She had walked away believing distance would be enough, that silence would finally loosen its grip. But suffering has a way of circling back, especially when it wears the face of a child. Her daughter fell ill during the rains. At first it was small, a fever that came and went. Then the coughing started, deep, tearing, the kind that bends a child's body inward. The widow tried herbs. Tried prayer spoken without witnesses. Tried patience. But when the child stopped eating, she knew. The nearest healer who understood such sickness lived beyond the village she had sworn never to enter again. So she returned, quietly. No announcement. No greeting. Her bare head was covered now, not out of shame, but habit. Still, people noticed. A woman returning does not go unseen in a place that feeds on memory. Doors closed again. Conversation stalled. Children were pulled back indoors. The elders had before they saw her. They did not send for her immediately. They waited, testing whether her presence alone would disturb the fragile calm that had settled after her departure. And it did. Old questions resurfaced. Whispers crept back into familiar corners. She has returned. Why now? Did she think we forgot? The widow stayed near the healer's hut, tending to her daughter, pretending not to feel the weight of ice pressing against her back. But the village remembered her too well. And when a village remembers you, it rarely does so kindly. It happened faster than she expected. Another man died, suddenly. This time, the widow was not the wife in question. She watched from the edges as the same quiet machinery began to move. The same careful avoidance of words. The same tightening of faces. Only now, people hesitated. The new widow was younger. Quieter. She cried openly before anyone could stop her. Her hair was long, untouched. The elders gathered. Voices rose and fell behind closed doors. The village waited. Someone mentioned the oath. Someone else mentioned the last time. The widow understood then. Her resistance had not destroyed tradition. It had complicated it. The elders argued, not about justice, but risk. About what people might say. About how outsiders might watch. About whether silence would still hold if forced too tightly. The younger widow was called before them. But no blade appeared. Instead, conditions were offered. Restrictions. Isolation. Observation. A softer punishment, wearing the same bones. The village breathed out, relieved. But relief carried discomfort now. Because everyone knew. This change had not come from wisdom. It had come from fear. The widow felt something twist inside her, not triumph, but responsibility. She had cracked the wall, but someone else would bleed in the opening. And that knowledge sat heavier than hunger ever had. The drunkard brother-in-law did not survive the shift. When traditions weaken, power looks for something smaller to crush, to prove it still exists. He was an easy choice. Whispers turned toward him about negligence, about bad blood, about the shame he had brought by failing to control the widow when it mattered. His drinking, once ignored, became evidence. His poverty, once pitied, became guilt. They blamed him for the tension. For the questions. for the village no longer feeling whole. He came to the widow one night, staggering, not drunk, just afraid. "They want someone to carry it," he said, voice breaking. "All of it." She listened. For the first time, she saw him clearly, not as a choice imposed on her, but as another body shaped by the same cruelty. He had never wanted power. He had only wanted to disappear safely. The next morning, he was summoned. By evening, his hut was empty. No explanation was given. No farewell allowed. The village accepted it with practiced ease. Balance had been restored. Or so they told themselves. The widow felt the truth settle cold in her chest. Tradition did not protect people. It consumed them, one at a time. And she was no longer sure silence was enough. The healer spoke by accident. Old age loosens tongues the way hunger loosens pride. One evening, while tending the child, the healer muttered something that did not fit. "He complained of pain days before," she said. "Your husband." The widow froze. Pain. No one had mentioned pain before. Slowly, carefully, the widow asked questions. Not accusations. Just curiosity wrapped in concern. And piece by piece, something ugly surfaced. Her husband had been ill. Quietly. Ignored. Work had been prioritized. Rituals delayed. Complaints dismissed as weakness. When he died, it was easier to blame mystery than neglect. The oath had never been about truth. It had been about comfort. The widow sat with that knowledge for days, feeling its weight settle into her bones. The gods had been silent because there had been nothing to punish. The village had created guilt to avoid responsibility. She now carried something more dangerous than anger. She carried clarity. And clarity, once spoken, could not be taken back. The elders called her again. This time, they did not pretend authority. Their voices were careful. Measured. They offered compromises, protection, silence dressed as peace. "You have endured enough," one said. "Let the past rest." The widow listened. Then she asked a single question, quiet, precise. "If my husband had lived, would any oath have been needed?" No one answered. She stood slowly. Felt the room hold its breath. She could speak now. Expose everything. Shatter the remaining illusion. Or she could live, carrying the truth with her, letting the village sit with its unease. The elders watched her face, trying to read which wound she would choose to open. Outside, the village waited. And for the first time, the silence was afraid of her. The question came from her daughter. It was not asked in anger, or fear, or confusion. It was asked the way children ask things, softly, honestly, without knowing they are opening wounds adults have spent years covering. "Mother," she said one evening, watching the fire shrink into embers. "If father was not bad, why did everyone need you to suffer?" The widow did not answer immediately. She watched the flame instead, how it burned without apology, how it did not ask permission to consume what fed it. She thought of the elders, of the oaths, of shaved hair scattered on the ground like something discarded. What answer could explain cruelty disguised as order? She pulled her daughter close and said only this. "Because some people are afraid of truth, and they think pain can hide it." The child nodded, accepting this the way children do, not fully understanding, but storing it somewhere deep. A seed planted without ceremony. That night, the widow realized something with sudden clarity. Her resistance was no longer just hers. The village had failed to shape her daughter through silence. And that, more than any public confrontation, frightened them. Because children remember differently. They do not soften stories. They do not excuse harm with tradition. And one day, they asked questions no one prepared for. No elder stood before the village to declare change. There was no meeting. No apology. No admission. But slowly, quietly, something shifted. When another widow lost her husband months later, her hair was cut, but not fully. A small mercy, unnoticed by outsiders, heavy with meaning to those who understood. The oath was spoken, but without spectators. Without spectacle. Some rules were enforced less harshly. Some punishments delayed, then forgotten. People pretended nothing had changed. But the widow saw it. Tradition had not been defeated. It had been wounded. And wounded things behave differently. The elder spoke with more care now. Glances lingered longer before decisions were made. Silence no longer felt safe, it felt watched. The widow did not claim this shift. She did not return to demand credit. Change that announces itself invites correction. This one was allowed to survive, because it hid. Still, the village could not look at her the same way again. She had become something dangerous. Not a rebel. Not a hero. A reference point. And every time a rule felt too heavy, someone remembered her shaved head, her hunger, her refusal. That memory worked quietly. Like water against stone. Stories began to change. They always do. In time, people told her story differently, softened the edges, blurred the cruelty. They said she had been difficult. That she had misunderstood tradition. That her suffering was unfortunate, but necessary. They praised her strength. But removed the reason she needed it. Children had a cleaner version. One where the village was never wrong, only misunderstood. One where obedience remained sacred. The widow heard these stories and said nothing. Correcting them would require returning, standing again in the space where truth had already been refused. She understood now. Some lies survive because they are comfortable. But even comfort has cracks. People lowered their voices when they spoke of her. They glanced around, as if afraid she might hear, even from far away. They never used her name in warnings. They simply said, "Do not let it become like before." And everyone knew what before meant. She had become a shadow in the village's memory, not feared, but uneasy. A reminder that silence could fail. And reminders do not need permission to exist. Years later, she was invited. Not summoned. Invited. A gathering. A discussion. A chance, they said, to finally heal old wounds. She stood at the edge of the village, listening to the words flow toward her. Words shaped like regret. Like reconciliation. Her daughter stood beside her now, older, sharper-eyed, already learning which truths were safe to say aloud. The widow understood what the invitation meant. They wanted closure. They wanted her voice, controlled, softened, approved. They wanted to say they had listened, without changing the foundation that made listening dangerous. She could speak. She could tell the full truth. Expose neglect. Name cowardice. Or she could refuse and leave the story unfinished. She chose refusal. Not out of fear. Out of wisdom. Because truth offered too late often serves the powerful more than the wounded. She turned away. Behind her, the village remained standing, unchanged in shape, altered in spirit. And that was enough. The village still exists. Children are born. Men die. Traditions continue. But something never returned to its old place. When a woman lowers her head now, someone wonders why. When silence falls too quickly, it feels heavier than before. When a rule is enforced, eyes flicker with doubt. They do not say her name. They do not need to. Absence has weight. The widow lives elsewhere now. Her daughter walks freely, asking questions without punishment. They are not rich. They are not celebrated. But they are unowned. And in the village she left behind, something remains unsettled. Not broken. Not healed. Just aware. Because some stories are not meant to end with justice. Only with remembrance. And remembrance is where real change waits.